Elizabeth adjusted her heavy pearl necklace and pointed a manicured finger directly at my 8-year-old daughter. We were gathered in the grand foyer of the estate for the highly anticipated 50th anniversary family portrait. The hired photographer was waiting patiently by his tripod. Maya stepped forward, smiling brightly in her new dress, but Elizabeth's hand shot out like a velvet barrier. She leaned in, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for my ears. "This is for the bloodline," she whispered coldly, "not the strays. Before I tell you what my husband finally said to silence them all, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I want to see who is standing with us tonight." I didn't gasp, I didn't cry, I didn't ask why, and I certainly didn't beg for her acceptance. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was entirely clinical. For years, I had been conditioned to believe that family meant enduring disrespect to maintain a fragile peace. But looking at Elizabeth's cold eyes and my daughter's confused little face, the grand illusion completely shattered. I rubbed my eyes for a fraction of a second, attempting to summon a feeling of regret or sadness. But there was only absolute clarity. This wasn't an emotional breakdown, it was a balance sheet, and their account was now severely overdrawn. I didn't argue with Elizabeth. I simply reached out, took Maya's small, warm hand in mine, and turned away from the lavishly draped set. The photographer blinked, holding his heavy camera, unsure of what to do. The surrounding relatives murmured, expecting a dramatic scene, fully expecting me to plead for my child's inclusion in their historical archive. But I had absolutely nothing left to say to people who viewed my child as a deficit on their ancestral ledger. I walked Maya straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase to our private wing of the estate. I sat her down on her bed with her favorite illustrated book, kissed her forehead softly, and pulled out my laptop. Conflict initiated at 11:51 in the morning. Retaliation protocols engaged by 11:53. I didn't need to consult my husband Ryan just yet. I knew exactly where the financial arteries of this family were connected, and I knew exactly how to sever them. I immediately called my corporate attorney. I didn't want a family mediator. I wanted a ruthless asset manager. I instructed him to instantly freeze all executive access to the joint venture capital accounts. I was the primary signatory on the massive real estate holding company that legally owned the very roof Elizabeth was currently standing under. Within 10 minutes, I successfully revoked their corporate credit lines and suspended the operational budgets for the entire estate's maintenance. They thought they were preserving an elite legacy by casting out my adopted daughter. They genuinely didn't realize they were insulting the sole underwriter of their lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of family, blindly treating my massive financial contributions as a monthly subscription for their basic approval. I was entirely done footing the bill for a private club that refused to admit my child. I opened the estate's vendor management portal and began clicking cancel with rhythmic precision. The luxury caterers hired for tomorrow's celebratory brunch, cancelled. The exotic floral subscriptions that decorated the grand halls, cancelled. The luxury car leases held safely under my corporate shell company, suspended indefinitely. It was a rapid, systematic dismantling of their carefully curated social facade. They weren't going to be shocked by what they'd done to Maya. They were going to be utterly paralyzed by the fact that I had stopped playing along. My pulse was remarkably steady. I sat back and watched the cancellation confirmation emails roll into my inbox one by one. The grand, imposing illusion of their generational wealth was built entirely on my modern-day corporate grind, and I had just pulled the foundational brick out from under them. As the cancellation confirmations populated my screen, vivid memories flickered through my mind like an old, poorly lit film reel. The grand estate we were currently residing in hadn't looked this pristine 5 years ago. When Ryan and I first moved in to supposedly help his parents manage their affairs, the slate roof was leaking terribly and the entire west wing was practically uninhabitable. I paid for the massive renovations. I personally funded the imported Italian marble floors that Elizabeth now paraded her high society friends across. I bankrolled the elite landscape architects who designed the lush botanical gardens where she currently refused to let Maya be photographed. All those years, I silently absorbed Elizabeth's subtle, sharp jabs and Marcus's quiet, arrogant dismissals. I tolerated the painful way they cheerfully handed out incredibly expensive gifts to their biological nieces and nephews while offering Maya generic, thoughtless trinkets they picked up at the last minute. I had foolishly fallen deeply into the bloodline myth trap. This is the insidious psychological snare where individuals are systematically conditioned to believe that shared DNA is the ultimate, unbreakable currency of human connection, and that those brought into a family by choice must constantly, desperately earn their keep. Society wrongly teaches us that biological ties are inherently sacred, forcing adoptive parents and children into a perpetual state of exhausting auditing, forever trying to prove our bonds are valid and worthy of respect. But biology doesn't automatically generate loyalty, and DNA certainly doesn't breed common decency. Elizabeth and Marcus used the archaic concept of bloodline not as a beautiful bond of unconditional love, but as a cruel, exclusionary weapon to fiercely protect their own fragile egos and hide their rapidly dwindling bank accounts. They skillfully hid their utter financial incompetence behind a thick, imposing wall of aristocratic snobbery. My relentless hard work, my late nights aggressively closing international marketing accounts, my substantial annual corporate bonuses, that was the actual, tangible lifeblood keeping their rusted family crest polished and presentable to the world. The cold, hard, undeniable logic of my choice finally crystallized in my mind. Family affection had always been a strict business transaction to them, nothing more. They were incredibly happy to consume my capital while completely rejecting my heart. Maya was just the innocent collateral damage in their desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain a pure lineage that hadn't actually produced anything of real value in over 2 generations. I didn't feel betrayed anymore. Betrayal implies that there was once broken trust. And I realized in that moment I had never truly trusted them. I had merely been paying an exorbitant emotional tax for temporary peace, but the tax had finally become too high. Sitting in that sunlit room, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of the photographer downstairs packing up his expensive equipment, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of emancipation. The bloodline myth was finally dead to me. The long audit was complete, the heavy liabilities were clearly identified, and I was actively liquidating the toxic asset. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Elizabeth brutally realized her platinum credit cards were bouncing at the local boutiques. But instead of approaching me with a sincere apology, or even a tiny shred of humility, she chose immediate, reckless escalation. She frantically activated her social network. Elizabeth always treated local social standing as a weapon of mass destruction. She hastily invited a prominent local lifestyle reporter, a woman who routinely covered the estate's high society functions for the city magazine, into the grand drawing room for a sudden, impromptu interview about the importance of preserving family heritage. From the quiet shadows at the top of the stairs, I calmly recorded the entire audio on my phone. Elizabeth sat there, pouring Earl Grey tea with practiced, rigid elegance, and painted an absolute masterpiece of public gaslighting. She flatly called me mentally unstable, she whispered, with sickeningly feigned tragic concern, that I was deeply, pathologically jealous of the family's historical roots, simply because I came from a working-class background. She cleverly framed the cruel exclusion of my 8-year-old daughter from the portrait, not as an act of malice, but as a highly private, sacred family tradition that I was simply too unsophisticated and uncultured to understand. She was heavily banking on my silence. She fully expected me to crumble under the crushing weight of public defamation, to tearfully apologize just to make the profound embarrassment stop. This is a classic, highly documented manipulation tactic designed to perfectly trigger the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a terrifying psychological phenomenon where victims of systemic, prolonged emotional abuse are deeply conditioned to doubt their own reality whenever the abuser heavily projects confidence and authority. The invisible chain violently pulls you back into submission by convincing you that if everyone else blindly believes the abuser's polished, articulate narrative, your pain must simply be a delusion. It makes you feel that fighting back is actually a symptom of your own madness. But my invisible chain had already been permanently snapped. I didn't run down the stairs screaming in defense of my character. I didn't interrupt the interview to loudly state my case. I stood perfectly still, documenting every single defamatory word, every blatantly slanderous accusation. Uncontrolled anger is a massive liability when you desperately need to be precise. This wasn't just a petty family dispute anymore, it was a rapidly mounting, highly lucrative legal case. Every sweet-sounding lie she told that reporter was another solid piece of admissible evidence for my attorney. I was gathering heavy ammunition with complete clinical detachment. I watched her smile warmly for the camera, completely unaware that she was actively digging her own financial and social grave. She thought she was masterfully controlling the narrative, but she was merely providing sworn, undeniable testimony of her own malice. I securely saved the audio file, immediately backed it up to 3 different encrypted cloud servers, and forwarded it directly to my legal team with a very simple subject line: add this to the defamation suite. The gaslighting campaign wasn't hurting me. It was beautifully fortifying my case. The massive turning point of the day didn't actually come from my actions alone. It came directly from Ryan. My husband had been completely quiet all afternoon, locked away in his home office. He had seen exactly what his mother did in the foyer. He had watched me silently take Maya upstairs. And unlike the weak, compliant men in the generations before him, Ryan did not instinctively default to protecting the patriarchs. His internal, fundamental shift was absolute and terrifyingly quiet. At precisely 6 o'clock in the evening, Ryan walked into our bedroom. His face was chalky pale, but his eyes were entirely devoid of emotion. He didn't offer any weak apologies for his parents' behavior. He didn't try to foolishly bridge the gap. He simply walked over and handed me a thick, heavy stack of freshly printed documents and a small silver USB drive. He had spent the last 6 unbroken hours systematically bypassing his father's outdated security protocols on the estate's main private server. What I saw meticulously documented on those pages instantly transformed this situation from a bitter, localized emotional dispute into a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. Marcus hadn't just been passively aggressive toward Maya, he had been highly active. Ryan had successfully uncovered hidden digital logs and heavily encrypted emails between Marcus and a disgraced, unlicensed estate planner. They had meticulously and illegally forged the primary family tree documents, maliciously altering complex trust structures and illegally redrafting the foundational legacy charters. Their ultimate documented goal was to permanently disinherit Maya, legally ensuring that not a single cent of the estate's massive assets that were primarily funded by my direct, heavy capital injections, could ever legally pass to an adopted child. Marcus had committed rampant, highly documented fraud, brazenly falsifying legal signatures and illegally backdating complex addendums to make it look like the exclusionary clauses had been firmly in place for decades. Ryan looked at me, his voice barely a whisper, and said, "They didn't just reject our daughter. They tried to legally erase her existence while actively stealing our money to fund the erasure." The betrayal ran so incredibly deep it had actually mutated into a federal felony. Ryan immediately contacted my attorney himself, securely handing over every single digital log, traced IP address, and clearly forged signature. We weren't just freezing bank accounts anymore. We were meticulously preparing a surgical strike that would completely level the entire institution. The Grand Estate Gala, a massive, opulent event scheduled for the following evening to publicly celebrate their 50 years of so-called prestigious standing, was going to be the absolute perfect venue. They had invited 300 of the city's most wealthy and elite figures. They desperately wanted an audience to validate their superiority. We were going to give them a spectacular show. There was absolutely no sadness left in our room, only the cold, incredibly sharp edge of impending execution. The massive ballroom was a glittering sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing vintage champagne, and 300 of the city's most influential elites. Elizabeth and Marcus stood proudly on the grand stage, beaming with arrogant pride, preparing to give their long-winded toast, celebrating 50 years of unbroken, supposedly pure family legacy. Maya was safely and happily asleep at a 5-star luxury hotel across town, watched over by a highly trusted, bonded nanny. Ryan and I stood quietly in the very back of the opulent room, completely unbothered by the glittering, fake facade surrounding us. At exactly 8:30, Marcus tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The massive room immediately quieted down. Before he could utter a single hypocritical word about the importance of tradition, Ryan walked straight up the center aisle. He didn't shout, he didn't make a chaotic scene. He simply walked with heavy purpose to the main audiovisual booth and calmly plugged in the silver drive. Suddenly, the massive high-definition projection screens that were supposed to show the historical family portrait dramatically flashed with high-resolution images of Marcus's blatantly forged trust documents, brightly highlighted emails detailing the exact nature of the fraud, and undeniable bank statements showing my exact, massive financial contributions that single-handedly kept the estate from foreclosure. The entire room gasped in perfect unison. The heavy silence that followed was completely suffocating. Ryan calmly took the microphone from his father's violently trembling hand. He looked out at the 300 stunned guests and spoke with terrifying, absolute calmness. "There is absolutely no legacy here tonight," he said, his strong voice echoing loudly off the imported marble walls. "There is only a massive, multi-million-dollar fraud maliciously committed against my wife and my beautiful daughter." Elizabeth's overly powdered face completely drained of color. Marcus sputtered incoherently, frantically waving his arms and trying to physically block the projector lens. But the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open, and 3 uniformed police officers, accompanied closely by our lead attorney, walked in. They completely bypassed the whispering guests and stepped directly onto the grand stage. Elizabeth and Marcus were publicly escorted out of their own lavish gala, profoundly humiliated in front of the very high society they had religiously worshipped above their own flesh and blood. As they were slowly led down the carpeted steps, I locked eyes with Elizabeth. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply handed her a thick, legally binding manila folder. The ultimate finisher. It was the formal, unchallengeable legal notice of the estate's complete and immediate seizure due to massive financial default and highly documented fraudulent practices. "You desperately wanted to protect the bloodline," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but cutting sharply through the dead silence. "Consider it protected. You have absolutely nothing else left to inherit." The grand, sprawling estate was unceremoniously sold at a public auction exactly 6 months later. Ryan and I didn't even bother to attend. We were far too busy happily closing on a beautiful, modern, sun-drenched home right by the coast, surrounded by natural light and wide open spaces. There were absolutely no dark, imposing mahogany staircases here. No heavy, depressing oil paintings of judgmental ancestors staring down at you from the walls. And absolutely no exclusionary velvet ropes dictating who belonged. I've come to realize that the ultimate cost of silence in the face of toxic tradition is simply too high a price to pay for anyone's soul. When you silently tolerate blatant disrespect simply to keep the peace, you are essentially financing your own complete emotional bankruptcy. Establishing firm boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate, necessary act of self-preservation and profound love for the people who actually matter in your life. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the absolute only way to set yourself free. I don't passionately hate Elizabeth and Marcus anymore. I don't feel anything for them at all. They are simply a permanently closed account on a massive balance sheet I no longer have any reason to review. Maya's bright new room directly overlooks the crashing ocean. Yesterday afternoon, we took our very own family portrait right on the sandy beach. It was just the 3 of us, happily barefoot in the warm sand, laughing uncontrollably as the ocean waves crashed gently against our ankles. There were absolutely no forced smiles, no rigid, uncomfortable poses, and absolutely no one standing isolated off to the side. We framed that beautiful picture in simple, elegant driftwood and hung it proudly, right in the exact center of our new living room. We successfully built our beautiful chosen family directly from the smoldering ashes of a highly toxic, burning dynasty. We learned the hard way that true, meaningful lineage isn't inherited through simple blood. It is powerfully forged through unwavering loyalty, heavily earned through deep mutual respect, and fiercely protected by unyielding daily courage. Ryan proudly stood by us when it mattered the absolute most, definitively proving that a real, genuine partner doesn't just hold your hand during the good times, they fiercely help you hold the line during the war. Our daily life is incredibly peaceful now, entirely and strictly dictated by our own personal terms. We confidently dictate exactly who sits at our dinner table, and the absolute only requirement for entry into our home is genuine, unconditional love. The old supposed legacy was nothing more than a dark, suffocating prison cleverly disguised as a beautiful palace. Our new, bright legacy is a wide open door to a life incredibly well lived, free from the heavy, invisible chains of the past. If you've ever had to bravely choose yourself over a deeply toxic family legacy, hit that subscribe button right now. You are absolutely not alone in this fight, and your personal story truly matters to me. Tell me your personal boundary setting story in the comments below. I'm reading every single one of them.